Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for giving up your time and coming to listen to me talk about the research that I've done. I thoroughly enjoyed doing the research myself. There was lots of stressful moments as well, but the time I spent talking to the participants was just absolutely incredible for me. So the title of my research was What Can We Learn from Autistic SLTs About Neuroaffirming Practice? So I'll be going through sort of the literature that was the background to my study, and then the research and what I found out from the participants, and then recommendations and conclusions at the end. It is the very first time that I'm sort of presenting on what I found, and I'm really happy to be here, but also a little bit nervous as well. So if I'm jabbering on or saying anything that doesn't make sense, please just let me know and I'm happy to clarify anything. Okay. So just a little bit on my background before we start. So I am a non-autistic speech and language therapist myself. I've predominantly always worked with autistic people. I used to work one-to-one with an autistic boy whilst I was training, and he just really ignited in me a passion for understanding autistic people, listening to autistic people, and doing things differently in terms of what I was taught at the time in speech and language therapy. So I'm really interested in neuroaffirming practice, but particularly practice that is informed by autistic people specifically. So I wanted to do a master's in autism, and I chose Sheffield Hallam because it is an autism-led course. So the head of the course, he is autistic and went to a specialist school himself. And my main job is working in a specialist school, so that really appealed to me. And most of the lecturers on the course are autistic too. Long term, I'd love to be a lecturer myself on the speech language therapy course. I think things really are heading in the right direction in terms of neuroaffirming teaching for students, but I think there's always things that we can continue to change. So I would love to do that. And I'm potentially looking into PhD opportunities as well. If anyone's interested in the masters that I did, I really would recommend it, and the link is there at the bottom for you. So I'm using the term neuroaffirming throughout my research rather than neurodiversity affirming. And the reason for that, the definition that I've used within my dissertation, is that neuroaffirming practice encompasses the neurodiversity affirming practice, whilst also recognising perspectives, experiences and identities beyond neurodivergence must also be valued for truly affirming practice. So very much thinking about gender identity, sexuality, race, people being able to bring their whole selves to the therapy that we do with people, and that our approaches will be affirming to all aspects of their identities. Okay. So the background to my research, I started looking into what has constituted speech and language therapy for autistic people historically, and I knew it would be a difficult read, but it really was really shocking to me. So very much a medicalised and ableist history. There's a fantastic paper by Saint-Pierre and Saint-Pierre, where they talk about how speech and language therapy was introduced to streamline people's communication for industrial productivity, and basically if everyone communicates in the same way, there are more capital gains through that. So I'd really recommend that paper if you're interested. The earliest paper I could find specifically on speech language therapy was from 1966 and talked about autistic communication being deviant and alien and lacking, and that was a very difficult read as well. There's a fantastic paper by Nair, Cushing and Farrer, and they talk about how SLT remains even today very much a homogenous majority white female profession, and that is exacerbating the profession's contextualisation of the British and Euro-American colonialism. And lots of interesting information in there about how standardised assessments don't account for all different elements of people's identity. We know in our HCPC standards of proficiency that we must practice ethically, and one of those standards is about listening to the voices of the people that we work with. However, multiple research out there has found that there is a distinct lack of autistic voices that is informing current practice today. So ethical practice is definitely not synonymous with neuroaffirming practice currently, but it should be. There's a fantastic paper in the OT literature about neuroaffirming practice by Dolman et al. And they set out tenets for like good practice that is neuroaffirming within occupational therapy. But I could not find anything similar for speech and language therapy. So that was sort of my starting point. And once I'd read all this very well, not surprising, but very confronting research, I guess, I was questioning myself, why are we continuing with speech and language therapy for autistic people? Why am I doing a dissertation in this? Is this something that should still be happening? So explored research that is out there to answer that question. So in theory, speech and language therapists are communication experts. I don't know if we can ever really call ourselves the experts. However, we have a good level of knowledge in communication. And we know that communication breakdown often occurs between people of different neurotypes, and therefore it can be our role to help bridge that gap. And a lot of the work that we do will be with non-autistic people, helping them to understand and better communicate with the autistic people we might work with. There are some systematic necessities for speech and language therapy. So in the NICE guidelines, in the autism assessment section, it is required that a speech and language therapist is part of that assessment for a diagnosis to be made. And it is recommended that a speech and language therapist is part of the adult assessment process as well. There is some evidence that autistic people ask for speech and language therapy. So this paper by Cummins et al., they interviewed autistic adults who asked for support with interview skills and being assertive and overcoming communication barriers. However, there is no clear pathway for autistic adults accessing speech and language therapy at the moment in the UK. And then, of course, there's other communication needs as well. So we know autistic people are more likely to have a hearing impairment or Down syndrome or access gender identity services. But equally, they may develop acquired communication needs as anybody could, and therefore could come into contact with speech and language therapists for other reasons outside of the fact that they are autistic. So once I'd looked into this, I was satisfied then that it is the right thing to continue with speech and language therapy. We just need to significantly change how we are doing that for autistic people. So there is some great neuroaffirming literature out there about speech and language therapy. A lot of it is from the US, and whilst it's very interesting and informative, it's not always directly applicable to UK contexts. So I've just listed some of the papers here that had the biggest influence on my learning, really. So a paper by Ewan Sturt-Pony, who say that we need to shift our deeply entrenched understanding of autism within the profession. De Thorn and Gerlach-Hock. De Thorn does lots of work in autism, and Gerlach-Hock does a lot of work in stammering and affirming therapy and stammering services. They talk about it being the role of the speech and language therapist to promote self-identity around communication and neurodivergence. A great paper by Donaldson, I think she is from the UK, about increasing AAC access for all autistic people who want to use it, not just people who are non-speaking or semi-speaking. Santhanam and Belen Han. Santhanam does lots of work with university-age autistic people and talks about how there is a role for speech and language therapists within universities, especially working with lecturers and professors to adapt their communication so it's right for their students. I'm just going to have a sip of water. So they talk about it being the role of speech and language therapists to support the development of self-advocacy skills, and use approaches that honour autistic communication. So Santhanam did a study where she set up a video gaming suite in a university and invited students of different neurotypes, and found that playing games together helps to bridge that double empathy problem, and for people to be able to communicate more successfully with people of different neurotypes, and therefore reduce the stigma and prejudice of the non-autistic peers, which I think sounds like just the most brilliant piece of work. There is a shortage of Gestalt language processing assessment tools or guidance on creating AAC systems for Gestalt language processors. So that is another gap that is out there that Haydock et al. Found. And Rutherford and Johnston, who work up in Scotland, they recognise that many speech therapists desire a move towards neuroaffirming practice, but they lack the education and tools for transforming this into practice. So if anyone wants to do further reading after the workshop tonight, all of those papers there, I can't recommend highly enough, really. We've got a quote here from one of the participants in the study, who's Lauren. So she said, "A lot of people see it as if you are neuroaffirming, you're just neuroaffirming, and that's the end of the journey. But actually, it's a lifelong process." And when she said that, I thought that was a really good reminder for me and a good message to always be passing on when I am talking to people about neuroaffirming practice. We are constantly learning and adapting and improving the way we work for the people that we work with. And I think she's just summed it up really nicely there. So going into the research, I started off with 3 broad questions, which you can see here. So what are the experiences of autistic speech and language therapists regarding neuroaffirming practice? What insights can these experiences provide? And how do neuroaffirming practitioners address inherent ideas of ableism in speech and language therapy? So my research methods, this is the bit I hope people don't have too many questions on, because I definitely have to go back to the final dissertation to answer your questions thoroughly. But I used a qualitative, it was a qualitative study, so I was very much interested in individual people's experiences and insights rather than numerical data that I could compare and contrast. I used an interpretivist paradigm, so again that's where you believe that there isn't one single truth that exists, and lots of people's experiences can be concurrently true. I used a phenomenological methodology, and that similarly is interested in individual people's experiences. And we use semi-structured interviews to collect the information from the participants. So we had a rough outline of questions, but people could deviate as much or as little from them as they wanted to. So there were 6 participants. They are all speech and language therapists practicing in the UK. They all identify as autistic, some of whom have formal diagnoses and some who self-identify. And I really wanted to make it clear that people who self-identify were welcome in the study as well. So we had Eleanor, Serena, Jordan, Imogen, Robin and Lauren, and they were all pseudonyms. Okay, so I think I will just share this next slide with you, and then we might have a little break, and then we'll go on and look at what the themes were that came out of it. So there were three broad themes that emerged from the research. So theme 1 was about evolving practice, theme 2 was about shared neurotype, and theme 3 were professional issues. So theme 1 was all about evolving practice from that medicalised position that speech and language therapy has come from to more neuroaffirming practice. On each slide, we've got a quote from one of our participants and then information in the box that they shared during our discussions. So there was a recognition that we need to have national and service level developments to be able to move towards neuroaffirming practice. It was felt that if the RCSLT were to endorse the fact that self-identification is valid, that would remove a barrier to post-diagnostic only services. So when I was looking into this, lots of NHS services that are there for autistic people are only accessible once a diagnosis is confirmed. It was felt that speech and language therapy courses should include tutors with lived experience. And when I looked into these, Huddersfield Uni advertises in their prospectus that they do have tutors and guest speakers with lived experience of all the different types of communication differences they are talking about on their course, but they were the only course that I could find advertising that. Participants felt that report and goal templates should all be neuroaffirming, and that was something quite tangible that we might have within our power to action right away. It was felt that all SLTs should understand neuroaffirming practice, not just those working solely with autistic people. And I think that is really important because no matter which group of people we are working with as SLTs, we will be working with autistic people. And that employers should provide time dedicated to neuroaffirming CPD for all staff, not just SLTs. So everyone within the MDT, whether you've got admin staff, education staff, everybody should be having access to that neuroaffirming CPD. And Lauren said, changing systems takes time. It's about to get rocky in a good way. And I really hope so. So our second sub-theme within evolving practice was individual changes to practice and CPD. And a thing that came up quite often with participants was reflecting on our past practice and how we might have, for example, I have advocated for PECS in the past. And we might now look back on things that we have done and feel a huge mixture of emotions about it. But there's a lovely quote from Imogen there who said, don't beat yourself up about what you did in the past because you believed it was best practice at the time. So those reflections are really important, and we absolutely must allow time for that continual development. And it's all about reconstructing our professional knowledge so we are evolving practice together. Participants felt that obtaining consent from the people we work with should be imperative in any aspect of the work that we do, and that we must take a collaborative approach and co-construct our therapy. So, for example, determining targets together with the people we are working with, not just imposing the targets we think should be there on them. We must value autistic voices in everything that we do. So, for example, accepting autistic play skills. One participant had a really nice suggestion of what they do in their team around changing terminology gradually. So they pick one or two neuroaffirming terms per month. So that might be identity first language, for example. And everyone in the team makes sure that they are embedding those and using those in their reports for that month. And then once that term has been embedded, the next month they choose something else that everyone consistently works on. So I thought that was another really tangible strategy that could be used. Participants felt that we should be writing targets relating to the parent or carer communication or adapting the environment, and having a real focus on that, not just writing targets for the autistic person. People felt that we should be working with children and their peers jointly within the classroom, rather than withdrawing children for one-to-one speech and language therapy sessions, so we avoid excluding them from the classroom. It was felt that we very much have a role in developing self-awareness and self-advocacy skills, and fostering meaningful peer connections through shared interest groups as opposed to traditional social skills groups. We often see EHCPs that have ableist targets. I still see EHCPs that have things like eye contact on. So it needs to very much be our role to ensure that those discussions are being had at annual review meetings and updated where possible. And participants unanimously said that formalised CPD was essential for strengthening neuroaffirming practice. However, time, money and knowledge of neuroaffirming courses were all barriers to that learning. So again, they are systematic factors that employers need to be mitigating. And then the third sub-theme within evolving practice was the specific approaches and resources that we use. So neuronormative interventions like ABA were unanimously refuted by the participants. Participants said parents often ask for the social skills training and want to reduce so-called problem behaviour, or feel that social integration is vital for a child's future success. And therefore our time might be most valuably spent educating families about neuroaffirming practice, whilst also being aware of intersectional issues that might affect why parents are wanting that social integration, for example. Several participants said that access to interpreters was a significant barrier to parental education. Several participants said that intensive interaction could be a neuroaffirming approach, and wondered about intensive interaction for adults or speaking autistic people for whom there's little research about intensive interaction. And it was highlighted that we lack the formal tools to evaluate and evidence the impact of intensive interaction. And then that is another barrier in itself, because often our commissioners are wanting us to be able to show that clear progress using standardised assessments. Lots of the participants said ASC should be available to any autistic people wanting to use it. So, for example, core boards that are in the classroom that anybody can use, and felt that agency and autonomy of those using ASC must be prioritised. And the quote that I've got on this slide is from Serena, who was talking about introducing an ASC device to a child who had very little communicative agency prior to his device. And she said he's now using his device to have arguments with people and shout at people, and he must be feeling so empowered that he is now able to do that. It was felt that SLTs can support self-identity and acceptance through psychoeducation. And one participant talked about doing a project with a child all about autism and how autism affects them, and then supporting that child to share that with other people, and it being the role of the SLT to support families to continue that sort of psychoeducation at home as well, and how we can start the psychoeducation right from the first point of contact the neurodivergent child has with our services, whether that is for a diagnostic assessment or prior to that. And some participants felt that social stories and comic strip conversations can be neuroaffirming, but only if they are informed through the knowledge of that individual person and written or created by someone who uses neuroaffirming practice. Just having another sip of water. Okay. So moving on to theme 2 now, and theme 2 was about shared neurotype. So that is where you've got an autistic speech and language therapist working with an autistic person coming to access their services. So the first sub-theme is about working with autistic people. There was a difference in opinion between the participants about whether they disclose their neurotype to the people that they are working with. Some people felt that sharing their neurotype promotes empathy. So, for example, if you've got a good understanding of somebody's sensory differences or of what rejection sensitivity dysphoria might feel like, it means you might be able to plan for session endings more sensitively. It was felt that non-autistic SLTs must really strive to overcome the double empathy problem, and that can be achieved or can somewhat be achieved, but it really relies on those non-autistic SLTs having that education and being committed to changing their practice. And it was felt that collaborative or power with approaches, as McGreevy et al. Calls them, empower people to co-construct their SLT support. And on the whole, participants felt that a shared neurotype powerfully promotes understanding and acceptance as people's experiences are normalised. So one participant talked about unmasking in sessions with the young people that she was working with, and how through her doing that, the young people felt more able to unmask themselves, meaning that they felt better understood and less isolated, and then were free to begin that unmasking. And it was felt that that was especially important for people without a sense of identity, for whom that radical acceptance is particularly valuable for supporting their well-being. And then we've got a quote here from Eleanor. This was one of my favourite quotes in all of the interviews. I don't know if I should share that, but I just thought it was lovely. She was talking about doing autism assessments, and she said, "Sometimes I know someone's autistic because I realise we're suddenly talking about, it's not small talk, it's big talk. And all of a sudden you're talking about really important things with somebody you've known 5 minutes, which is fine by me. I love that." So that just really encapsulates the power of that shared neurotype and how effective it can be for autistic people who are lucky enough to have an autistic speech and language therapist work with them. Okay, the next sub-theme was language. So participants typically preferred identity-first language, which largely aligns with the autistic community, as found by Kenny et al., and they avoided functioning labels as well. It was felt that using neuroaffirming language is an ethical necessity for SLTs to avoid perpetuating injustice and ensuring that autistic perspectives are valued. Sorry, my voice is really going. So the reference I've got there is a book by Alexis Quinn, and she used to be an Olympic athlete and she didn't know she was autistic, and she reached autistic burnout. I think she was in her 20s or early 30s, and she was subsequently sectioned and just subject to really inhumane treatment and a real lack of understanding of autism, but autism in women particularly. And in the end, she managed to escape from the secure hospital that she was in. And she's written a fantastic book about that and how, if there were neuroaffirming speech and language therapists working in that setting, it could have had a really different outcome for her. Participants felt that SLTs should definitely be asking people about their strengths as well as their differences. And sometimes we do still have to write reports that include medicalised language, especially if that's in diagnostic reports, and that is something I do in my work as well. But we can write disclaimers explaining why that medicalised language is being used, and then providing alternative language alongside as well. It was felt that reports should accurately reflect the experiences of the people they are about, whilst affirming positive autistic identity. So Imogen said, having those differences and being autistic in a neurotypical world is pretty disabling and difficult. So we need to really make sure we are identifying what those difficulties or those barriers are, and not just focusing entirely on the strengths and differences of the people that we work with. And it was felt that we should avoid reinforcing shame, especially when we're working with colleagues who are maybe not as far along on the neuroaffirming journey as we are. So if a colleague is consistently using person first language, for example, it might be advising them to ask the individuals that they're working with what terminology is right for them. Okay, and the quote we've got here is from Eleanor, who says, children, or indeed the adults who I'm writing for, even if they're too young to read their report now, they will read it at some point. So that is the stance we should always be taking in our reports, being aware that even if the individual person isn't going to read that report right now, they might in the future, and we should never be having a negative impact on people with what we write in our reports. And then the third sub-theme in shared neurotype was ableism. Sorry, I've got a cat who's meowing at the door, so if you can hear a little meow, that's what it is. So it was felt that there's a failure to address ableism, including internalised ableism, means SLT may focus on social conformity and reinforce masking. So it's very much all of our roles to be addressing ableism. It was felt that intersectional identities, such as being Black and autistic, mean that combating ableism may be secondary to maintaining safety. So the reference that I've got there, this is a mum called Melissa Simmons, and she is on one of the episodes of 1800 Seconds on Autism, the podcast, talking about her fear for her son if or when he stims in public. So we just need to be really mindful that revolutionising SLT is not as easy as implementing a westernised view of what neuroaffirming practice is. Participants experienced ableism from colleagues. One participant talked about being questioned by colleagues around their professionalism due to their neurotype, and said we're often called unprofessional for the way that we do our speech and language therapy. We know that when ableism impacts communicative success and well-being, tackling ableism becomes our duty. Participants advocated for safe spaces to discuss topics such as ableism and internalised ableism, particularly at university. And this study by Nair et al. Found that ableist ideologies govern standardised assessments, and the systems that we work within often require that visible progress rather than valuing long-term impact on well-being and autonomy. So that remains a big barrier to us. And the quote here we've got from Lauren. She says, it's not as simple as removing turn-taking goals. I don't want to take away the option from them to be able to engage in something if they want to that requires turn-taking. So still very much that process of reflection and learning and adjusting our practice as we go. Okay. The third and final theme is professional issues. So the first sub-theme there is about masking and mental health. And the quote we've got here is from Robin, who said, "I masked for such a long period of time, I didn't allow myself to kind of recognise my own difficulties." So participants discussed the profound impact of masking on mental health. Some participants talked about having panic attacks, PTSD, anxiety, depression, and experiencing autistic burnout. And those experiences were quite unanimous, really, within the group of people that I spoke to. It was felt that disclosing autistic identity intersects with disclosing mental health conditions. Autistic people who have mental ill health have likely experienced ostracization, rejection, and victimization, and thus fear future disclosures. And the discussion here was particularly around disclosing your identity within the workplace. Therefore, autistic SLTs tend to avoid disclosing and mask more, and therefore they're more likely to burn out and retire time off work. And then financial penalties for being off work can further erode well-being and quality of life. Therefore, it's critical employers understand and support autistic employees and actively create inclusive environments where disclosing intersectional identities is encouraged. And I know we've got the recent guidance about supporting neurodivergent SLTs from the RCSLT, so hopefully that goes away to supporting this. The next sub-theme was about support at university and on clinical placements. This really varied between participants. Some participants felt that they were well supported at university, but more often than not, they felt support was inadequate and contributed to mental ill health and academic disruptions. It was felt that universities need to improve staff knowledge and skills in supporting autistic students, for example, through training co-produced with autistic people. One of the participants, she'd kept some feedback from a Viva she'd had at university. And it was really heartbreaking to hear actually how her communication style was conceptualized by the lecturers who'd written that. So the academic feedback was often positioned autistic communication as deficient, perpetuated ableism, and was reminiscent of those early conceptualizations of autistic communication that I mentioned at the beginning. The RCSLT's new guidance will hopefully help to safeguard future students, but it still doesn't take away from those past negative experiences that many autistic SLTs have had. Participants suggested addressing ableism at universities by embedding neuroaffirming teaching, and that should be rooted in social justice throughout all lectures, not just the lectures that are specifically about autism. The support on clinical placements varied even more. I'd say there was around a 50-50 split of people who felt that they did have really successful placements and those who didn't. Some educators were nurturing and gentle, which helped to reduce anxiety. Others were neuroaffirming, which enabled the students to thrive on placement. And one person talked about their experience of being paired with an autistic speech language therapy on placement, and how successful that was for their learning. The quote I've got here from Lauren, she says, "It's not just about being affirming of neurodiversity, but acknowledgement of differences in so many other ways, like gender identity and racism, so it aligns with social justice and equity." Okay, and then the final sub-theme here is around work life. So participants felt that positive environments characterised by better understanding and supportive attitudes foster belonging and acceptance at work. Conversely, people I spoke to who were working within more traditional systems still face resistance when advocating for inclusive approaches. Workplace barriers included the expectation to engage in small talk and uncomfortable traditional meeting formats, and that really highlighted the need for learning cultures which ensure all staff embrace neuroaffirming learning journeys. Leadership's knowledge and endorsement of reasonable adjustments is needed for understanding and acceptance, and participants felt that managers should proactively recognise when autistic SLTs need support and initiate supportive conversations. Participants advocated for remote working, disability network groups or messaging channels, and 6 monthly reasonable adjustment discussions with all employees to ensure that proactive support and employee retention is improved. And then it was felt that workplaces actively promoting neuroaffirming practice, for example, with email signatures with neurodiversity symbols or offers of different communication modes, help to foster inclusivity. And Imogen said, although she was the one who had talked about having 6 monthly reasonable adjustment discussions with employees, she said, I still feel like I don't know what reasonable adjustments to ask for. So that very much indicates that managers and supervisors need to deepen their understanding of what neurodivergent SLTs might need for them, from them, and what reasonable adjustments they might be able to offer. Okay, so that is the end of going through the themes that emerged. So these were my broad conclusions and recommendations that were in addition to what we've already discussed. So lots of systemic changes that need to happen at a national level or at an employer level. So mandatory induction training, time and funding for learning from neurodivergent creators. Employers, universities and clinical educators must understand neurodivergent presentations and facilitate reasonable adjustments. Give people the opportunity to share their neurotype if they want to. So that applies to if we are line managing or supervising people, but also the people who are coming to access speech and language therapy from us. Having that as a question, for example, on a case history form, can help to open up that discussion around neurotype if people choose to share that information. We should be educating families, carers and staff on neuroaffirming approaches. We should understand the evidence base of autism-focused approaches and the evidence base that is pro and against different types of approaches, so that when we are having those discussions about why we're using the approaches we have that evidence-based practice to back up what we're saying. We should be culturally attuned, so we should be considering race, gender and neurotype to successfully dismantle disabling systems of power. And we should be clearly communicating what people's support needs are. We should provide strategies to promote communicative success and autonomy. And we should be writing targets for the supporting adults as well as for the autistic people and the environment as well. So future directions, this is what I'm interested in and the gaps that I think are out there in the research. So I'd love to learn more about intersectionality in the context of neuroaffirming practice. And I couldn't find anything at all about neuroaffirming practice for people with acquired communication needs who are also autistic, so people who've had strokes, for example. So that's something I would really love to know more about, and if anyone knows of any research in that area, please do share it with me if you can. If you would like to read my full paper, it's available there on ResearchGate. And I've listed the references that I've covered in the slides today, and in the whole dissertation there are lots more research, and they are all referenced in the full dissertation. I've just put a slide in there about donations. If you would like to make a donation following the workshop tonight, Freedom for Girls is a charity based in Leeds, which is where I live, and they help to tackle period poverty, both in the UK and in Africa as well. And they've been to the school that I work in and done some really great work with some of the young people. And they were just really naturally neuro-affirming in everything that they have done. So I always like to support them if I can. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope it wasn't too much of an info dump all in one go. And I'd really love to hear any questions that